The galaxy was old. It had seen empires rise and fall like waves on an endless ocean. Over 200 species had joined the Galactic Concord, an alliance built on trade, diplomacy, and the shared belief that war was something only primitive civilizations practiced. The elder races, the Krelosi with their vast armadas, the Velith with their ancient knowledge, the Torvan with their living ships, had ruled the stars for tens of thousands of years. They had seen everything. They feared nothing. And then there were the humans. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage roughly 300 years ago, stumbling out of their home system with clumsy ships and wide eyes. They were small. Their lifespans were laughably short, barely a century compared to the Krelosi's 1,000-year lives. Their technology was crude. Their history was an embarrassing mess of wars, famines, and self-inflicted disasters that made the elder races shake their heads in quiet disbelief. The Conquered had welcomed them the way one might welcome a stray animal, with cautious kindness and low expectations. Humans were given trade routes nobody else wanted. They were allowed to colonize 12 worlds in a quiet, unremarkable corner of the galaxy. They were tolerated at Conquered assemblies but never invited to the inner circle, where real decisions were made. Most species forgot about humans entirely, unless they needed cheap labor or someone to handle a job too boring for anyone else. Captain Rhea Okonkwo had spent 6 years as Earth's junior diplomatic attaché to the Galactic Concord, and in those 6 years, she had learned one thing above all else. Nobody in this galaxy took humans seriously. She sat in the back row of every assembly. Her reports were filed and never read. When she spoke, the elder delegates smiled the way adults smile at children trying to explain something they do not understand. She had made peace with it, mostly. That peace ended on a Tuesday. The signal came without warning. It burst across every communication frequency in known space, military channels, civilian bands, even the ancient emergency networks that had not been used in 10,000 years. Every species heard it at the same moment. Every ship, every station, every world. The message was short. It was not in any known language, yet every translation system in the galaxy decoded it instantly, as if the signal itself wanted to be understood. They are coming, the hallowed ones return, all who hear flee or fall. For 3 full seconds, the Conquered Assembly Hall was silent. Rhea watched from her back row seat as 200 species processed the words. She saw confusion first, then recognition, spreading across the faces of the elder delegates like a shadow crossing a field. Then she saw something she had never seen before on the faces of beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia. Fear. The Conquered's archivists worked through the night. Ancient records were pulled from vaults that had not been opened in thousands of years. The data was fragmented, corrupted by time, but the picture it painted was clear enough to make even the oldest delegates go pale. The Hallowed Ones were not a species. They were a force, a vast parasitic armada of biomechanical ships that moved through the galaxy like a plague. They consumed everything. Worlds, fleets, entire civilizations. They stripped planets down to bare rock and used the raw materials to build more of themselves. They did not negotiate. They did not communicate. They simply ate. The last time they had appeared was over 40,000 years ago. 3 elder civilizations, species so advanced that even the current Conquered considered them legends, had faced the Hallowed Ones. All 3 were gone, not defeated, not conquered, erased. The only reason anyone knew about them at all was because a handful of automated warning beacons had survived, drifting in dead space for millennia, waiting to scream their message at anyone who would listen. Now those beacons were screaming again. The emergency session of the Inner Circle lasted 4 days. Rhea was not invited, of course. No human was, but she watched the broadcasts. She saw the arguments, the accusations, the finger-pointing. The Krelosi demanded that the Velith commit their fleets first. The Velith insisted that the Torvan take the front line. The Torvan refused to send their living ships into a fight they considered unwinnable. Nobody wanted to lead. Nobody wanted to be the first to bleed. Meanwhile, reports poured in from the border systems. Scout ships had made contact with the Hollowed One's vanguard. The descriptions were nightmarish ships that looked like they were alive, pulsing with stolen energy, moving in swarms so thick they blocked out the stars. 3 border colonies had already gone dark. No distress calls. No survivors. The galaxy was paralyzed. The most powerful civilizations in known space stood frozen, watching the darkness creep closer, arguing about who should step into its path. On the 5th day, Rhea Okonkwo did something that no human had ever done in 300 years of galactic diplomacy. She walked to the front of the conquered assembly hall. She did not ask permission. She did not wait to be recognized. She simply walked past rows of towering alien delegates, her boots clicking on the polished floor, until she stood at the central podium, the one reserved for inner circle members. The hall went quiet, not out of respect, out of sheer surprise that the small human woman had the nerve. Rhea looked out at 200 species. She saw the fear in their eyes. She saw the hesitation. She saw ancient, powerful civilizations waiting for someone else to go first. She leaned into the microphone and asked one simple question. Has anyone actually tried calling Earth? The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was not shock. It was confusion. A few delegates exchanged glances. The Krelosi ambassador frowned. The Velith elder tilted its enormous head. Why would anyone call Earth? What could humans possibly do? Rhea did not wait for an answer. She stepped back from the podium, pulled out her personal communicator, and opened a channel she had never used before, a channel every human diplomat carried but prayed they would never need. The emergency line to United Terran Command. The call lasted 11 seconds. Rhea spoke 4 words. It's time, wake up. On the other end, a voice she did not recognize replied with 2 words that would change the course of galactic history. Already awake. Somewhere beneath the mountains and oceans of a quiet blue planet that the galaxy had forgotten, something very old and very powerful began to stir. Lights flickered on in places that had been dark for a century. Engines that had never fired roared to life. And across 12 colony worlds, billions of humans stopped what they were doing and looked up, as if they had all heard the same distant sound. The sound of Earth finally answering. Admiral Kofi Asant had spent 40 years in the United Terran Command. He had trained for a war that most people believed would never come. He had overseen construction projects buried so deep beneath the Earth's surface that even satellites could not detect them. He had signed off on budgets hidden inside other budgets, approved weapon designs that would never be published, and spent countless sleepless nights reviewing battle plans for an enemy that had not existed in 40,000 years. People had called him paranoid. Politicians had questioned his funding. Journalists had written opinion pieces about the waste of resources on a military that Earth would never need. Kofi had read every one of those articles. He had smiled at each of them, and he had kept building. Now, standing in the command center buried 3 kilometers beneath the Sahara Desert, watching red alerts cascade across a wall of screens the size of a football field, he felt no satisfaction in being right. He felt only the cold, steady calm of a man who had prepared his entire life for this exact moment. Activate Iron Root, he said. All sites full deployment. The order traveled at the speed of light. Beneath the Himalayas, doors that had not opened in 100 years ground apart, revealing caverns large enough to hold cities. Inside those caverns sat warships, row after row after row of them, dark-hulled and angular, built without beauty or grace, designed for one purpose only: survival. Under the Atlantic Ocean, similar doors opened along the mid-ocean ridges. Ships rose from the depths like ancient creatures waking from a long sleep, water cascading from their hulls as they broke the surface and climbed toward the sky. In the frozen wastes of Antarctica, launch platforms cracked through ice sheets that had covered them for decades. in the mountains of South America, in the plains of Central Asia, in the deep forests of Scandinavia. Everywhere, hidden installations revealed themselves. Project Ironroot had been humanity's greatest secret. For 3 centuries, while the galaxy dismissed Earth as a museum planet, the United Terran Command had been building. Not openly, not proudly, quietly, patiently. The way humans had always prepared for the worst, with one hand extended in friendship and the other gripping a weapon behind their back. 4,000 warships, each one armed with weapons the conquered had never seen because humans had never shared them. Railguns that accelerated tungsten slugs to a fraction of light speed. Missile systems carrying warheads that could crack a moon. Point defense networks so dense that approaching fighters would fly into a wall of metal. And armor, not the elegant energy shields the conquered species favored, but layers upon layers of composite plating, thick and heavy and ugly, designed around a simple philosophy that only humans would embrace. You will get hit, make sure you survive it. But Ironroot was only the beginning. Across 12 colony worlds, the Lazarus Doctrine activated. It was not a weapon. It was not a fleet. It was a way of thinking, a cultural framework that humanity had woven into every aspect of colonial life so quietly that even the colonists themselves barely noticed it until the moment it was needed. On the farming world of New Caledonia, grain silos opened to reveal weapon caches that had been maintained by local volunteers for generations. Transport ships that had spent their lives hauling wheat and livestock were pulled into makeshift dry docks, where teams of engineers began welding armor plating onto their hulls and mounting gun turrets on their cargo bays. The work was rough. It was ugly. But it was fast, because every engineer on New Caledonia had trained for exactly this conversion since they were teenagers. On the mining colony of Vesta Prime, ore haulers became troop transports. Mining lasers were recalibrated into cutting beams that could slice through ship hulls. The miners themselves, men and women who spent their lives cracking asteroids in hard vacuum, reported to their unit commanders with the calm efficiency of people who had always known this day might come. On every human world, the pattern repeated. Teachers became officers. Doctors became field medics. Students who had thought their mandatory survival training was a pointless tradition suddenly understood why every human school in the galaxy taught basic combat tactics, zero-gravity movement, and emergency field repair, alongside mathematics and literature. It was not that humans were natural soldiers. It was that they had never allowed themselves to forget what it meant to fight for survival. Their history, the ice ages, the plagues, the world wars, the near-extinction events that had marked every chapter of their existence, had taught them a lesson that no other species in the galaxy had learned. Peace is precious, but it is never permanent, and the species that forgets how to fight is the species that does not survive. The Galactic Conquered watched with a mixture of awe and horror as humanity transformed. Intelligence reports flooded into the Conquered assembly. Satellite imagery of thousands of warships emerging from a planet everyone had written off as irrelevant. Communication intercepts filled with calm, professional military chatter from colonies that had been classified as agricultural backwaters. Economic data showing that human industrial output had tripled in 72 hours as civilian factories switched to military production, with a smoothness that suggested they had been designed for exactly this purpose. The Kralosi ambassador stared at the reports and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked his aide a single question. How did we miss this? The answer was simple. They had missed it because they had not been looking. Humans were small. Humans were young. Humans were noisy and emotional and short-lived. Nobody looks for a hidden army inside a species they consider barely worth noticing. But the deepest secret was not the ships or the weapons or the factories. It was the Aegis program. Deep beneath the old university city of Geneva, in a facility that was officially listed as a historical archive, A network of artificial intelligences came fully online for the first time in their existence. They had been learning for 300 years, studying every war humanity had ever fought, from ancient battles with swords and shields to the colonial skirmishes of the last century. They had analyzed millions of engagements, billions of tactical decisions, trillions of variables. The Aegis network did not fight. It thought. It processed battlefield data in real time, feeding recommendations to every ship, every unit, every commander in the Terran military simultaneously. It could see patterns no human mind could grasp. It could predict enemy movements based on data so subtle that even the best admirals would miss it. And it could adapt, rewriting its own tactical models mid-battle as new information arrived. It was not a weapon. It was a brain. And when it woke up, every ship in the Terran fleet suddenly became part of a single, vast, impossibly coordinated organism. Admiral Assant stood on the bridge of his flagship, the TCS Endurance, a dreadnought so large it had its own internal weather system. Around him, the first Terran expeditionary armada was forming up. 1,200 warships, crewed by men and women who had trained their whole lives for a war they hoped would never come. He opened a channel to the fleet. "This is Admiral Assant. You know why we are here, you know what is coming. I will not lie to you, the days ahead will be hard. Many of us will not come home, but I want you to remember something. Remember who we are. We are the children of a world that tried to kill us every single day of our existence. Ice ages, volcanoes, asteroids, plagues, we survived them all. We survived ourselves. And we did not survive by being the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. We survived because we are the most stubborn species this galaxy has ever produced. So when the enemy comes, and they will come, I want you to show them what stubbornness looks like." Assant out. The fleet moved. 4,000 ships from Earth. Thousands more from the colonies, converted freighters and mining ships and passenger liners, ugly and scarred and bristling with hastily mounted weapons. The galaxy had forgotten about humanity. It was about to remember. The hollowed ones moved through the galaxy like a slow, unstoppable fire. In the 3 weeks since the first signal, they had consumed 11 worlds. Their method was always the same. The swarm would arrive, tens of thousands of biomechanical ships, each one a twisted fusion of stolen metal and living tissue, pulsing with the energy of everything they had devoured. They would surround a planet. They would descend. And within hours, the world would be stripped bare, its oceans drained, its atmosphere harvested, its surface scraped down to dead rock. The raw materials would be absorbed into the swarm, and new ships would grow from the remains. 3 conquered fleets had attempted to stop them. The Torvans sent their legendary living ships, organic vessels grown over centuries, each one a masterwork of biological engineering. The hollowed ones tore through them in 40 minutes. The Krelosi committed a battle group of 600 warships, their finest crews, their most advanced weapons. The engagement lasted 3 hours. Not a single Krelosi ship survived. After the third defeat, the conquered broke apart. The Velith hegemony, one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, formally surrendered. They sent envoys to the hollowed ones offering tribute, raw materials, star charts, the locations of inhabited worlds, anything to be spared. The swarm accepted the tribute and consumed the envoys. Then it continued advancing. The Krelosi retreated behind their home nebula and sealed their borders. The Torvans scattered. Dozens of smaller species simply ran, abandoning their colonies and fleeing toward the galactic rim. Hopping that distance alone would save them. A handful of species, those too stubborn or too desperate to flee, gathered their remaining ships at a rally point in the Varenthi corridor, a narrow stretch of space between 2 dense nebulae. It was a natural choke point. If the hollowed ones could be slowed anywhere, it would be here. But the Allied fleet was a mess. 40 different species, each with different ship designs, different communication systems, different tactical doctrines. They had never fought together. Most of them had never fought at all. Their commanders argued constantly about formation, about strategy, about who should hold the center and who should guard the flanks. Nobody trusted anyone else. Nobody wanted to be the first to die. They were still arguing when the Terran fleet arrived. Captain Okonkwo had been working without sleep for days, coordinating between the Allied commanders and the approaching human armada. She had watched the conquered dissolve in real time, watched ancient alliances crumble, watched civilizations older than human history abandon each other out of pure fear. It had changed something inside her. The quiet diplomat who used to sit in the back row was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who had stopped waiting for permission. She was on the bridge of the Allied command station when the sensors picked up the Terran fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the corridor. 1,200 warships. They came in tight formation, not the graceful, spread-out patterns the conquered species favored, but a dense, aggressive block of metal and firepower that looked less like a fleet and more like a fist. The Allied commanders stared at their screens. They had expected human ships to look like their civilian vessels, small, round, friendly. These were something else entirely. They were angular. They were dark. Their hulls were layered with armor so thick it distorted their silhouettes. They bristled with weapons that the conquered had no classification for. They looked like they had been built by a species that expected to be hurt and had decided to hurt back harder. Admiral Asant's flagship, the TCS Endurance, took position at the center of the corridor. He opened a channel to every ship in the combined fleet, human and alien alike. "This is Admiral Kofi Asant, United Terran Command. I know many of you do not know us. I know many of you do not trust us. That is fine. Trust is earned, and we have not earned it yet, but I will tell you what we are. We are not the oldest species here. We are not the wisest. We do not have the best technology or the longest history. What we have is experience, not with galactic war, but with survival. Where we come from, everything tries to kill you. The weather, the animals, the diseases. The planet itself, even other humans. We spent 10,000 years fighting each other before we ever looked at the stars. That is not something we are proud of, but it is something we are good at. So here is what I am asking. Form up behind us. Follow our lead. And when the enemy comes, do not hesitate. Do not second guess. Just fight. We will show you how." The Allied fleet reformed. Some grudgingly. Some with visible relief that someone, anyone, was finally willing to lead. The human ships took the center, the most dangerous position. Allied vessels spread out on the flanks according to a tactical plan that the Aegis network had calculated in seconds, optimized for each species' strengths and limitations. The hollowed ones arrived 6 hours later. The swarm poured into the Varenthi corridor like a dark river, thousands upon thousands of ships, their surfaces crawling with stolen biomass, their formations shifting and poolsing like a living thing. Sensors across the Allied fleet screamed warnings. The scale was beyond anything the defenders had prepared for. The Allied ships on the flanks began to waver. Several conquered captains broke formation, pulling back instinctively from the approaching wall of death. The human ships did not move. Admiral Asant gave one order: all ships hold the line, weapons free. The Terran fleet opened fire, and the Varenthi corridor turned white. Railguns hurled tungsten slugs at velocities that turned each projectile into a streak of superheated plasma. The slugs punched through hollowed one ships like needles through paper, each impact releasing enough energy to vaporize a city block. Missile swarms erupted from every human vessel, thousands of warheads guided by the Aegis network, each one finding a different target, each one detonating with precision that made the alien commanders gasp. The hollowed ones had never faced weapons like these. The conquered species used energy-based weapons, elegant beams and pulses that the swarm's living hulls could absorb and regenerate from. Human weapons were different. They were physical. They were brutal. They punched holes that could not be healed. They shattered structures that could not be regrown. The front wave of the swarm shuddered and broke apart under the barrage. For a moment, the Allied fleet dared to hope. Then the swarm adapted. The hollowed ones shifted their formation, spreading out to dilute the effectiveness of the railgun fire. They sent smaller, faster ships in spiraling attack runs, targeting the gaps between human vessels. They launched boarding pods and living missiles that latched onto ship hulls and began eating through the armor. The battle became chaos. Clean formations dissolved into 1,000 individual fights. Human ships took hits, terrible hits that would have destroyed any conquered vessel, but the layered armor held. Ships that lost entire sections of their hull kept firing. Crews sealed breached compartments, rerouted power around destroyed systems, and fought on with a stubbornness that defied logic. The Aegis network adapted faster than any living commander could. It rerouted fire patterns in real time, identified weak points in the swarm's shifting formations, and coordinated human ships into kill teams that isolated and destroyed enemy clusters with ruthless efficiency. And then the humans began doing things that no conquered species would ever consider. A group of human destroyers deliberately collapsed a nearby asteroid field, using their engines to shove massive rocks into the swarm's path. The resulting chaos split the enemy formation in half. A damaged Terran cruiser, its engines failing, turned toward the nearest hollowed one carrier and accelerated to maximum speed, ramming it head-on. The explosion destroyed both ships and 3 enemy vessels nearby. The crew had evacuated into escape pods seconds before impact, a maneuver they had clearly practiced. Other human captains used their own crippled ships as bait, drawing enemy vessels into carefully prepared crossfires. Mining ships from the colonies deployed industrial charges designed for breaking asteroids. The explosions were not elegant, but they were devastating. The conquered allies watched in stunned silence as the humans fought with a creativity that bordered on madness. There were no rules. There was no honor code. There was only a single burning determination to make the enemy pay for every meter of space. The Battle of the Varenthi Corridor lasted 19 hours. When it was over, the hollowed ones withdrew for the first time in 40,000 years. They did not flee. They simply pulled back, regrouping beyond sensor range, as if reconsidering their approach. The corridor was a graveyard. Wreckage from both sides drifted in clouds so thick that navigation was nearly impossible. The Allied fleet had lost 1/3 of its ships. The human fleet had lost 400 vessels and over 200,000 souls. But the line had held. And somewhere in the wreckage, on a battered flagship with half its decks open to vacuum, Admiral Assant sat in his command chair and allowed himself one slow breath. Around him, his surviving crew was already working patching systems, treating wounded, preparing for the next fight. Nobody celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate, but there was something new in the eyes of every alien commander who had watched the battle. It was not admiration, not yet. It was something simpler and more powerful. It was the realization that humans did not know how to quit. The memorials were short, they had to be. On every surviving human ship in the Varenthi corridor, crews gathered in whatever space they could find: mess halls with cracked walls, cargo bays still stained with blood, corridors lit by emergency lighting because the main power grid was gone. They stood in silence while names were read aloud. 200,000 names. On some ships, the list took hours. On others, where entire sections had been lost to vacuum, the list was shorter, not because fewer had died, but because nobody was left to remember them. When the names were finished, there was 1 minute of silence. Then the crews went back to work. The Kralosi ambassador, Voreth Talon, watched the memorials from the observation deck of the Allied command station. He had served the conquered for 300 years. He had seen wars, small ones, contained ones, the kind of polite conflicts that civilized species sometimes stumbled into before diplomacy reasserted itself. He had never seen anything like this. It was not the grief that disturbed him. Every species grieved. It was what came after. The humans did not collapse. They did not demand time to process their losses. They did not question whether the fight was worth continuing. They wiped their eyes, straightened their uniforms, and returned to their stations as if death were simply another problem to be managed. Terrible, yes, but not paralyzing. Never paralyzing. He found Captain Okonkwo in a corridor outside the communications center, reviewing casualty reports on a cracked datapad. She had not slept in 2 days. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Ambassador, is there something you need?" Talon chose his words carefully. His species lived for 1,000 years. They planned in centuries. The idea of rushing into battle, absorbing catastrophic losses, and pressing forward was so alien to his thinking that he struggled to form the question. "Your people," he said, "they just lost 200,000 of their own. Your ships are broken. Your fleet is half destroyed. And yet your admiral is already planning the next engagement. I need to understand, is this madness, or is this something else?" Okonkwo set down the datapad. She looked at him for a long moment, and Talon saw something in her expression that he had never noticed before in a human face. It was not anger. It was not bravery. It was a kind of ancient tiredness, the look of someone who carried a weight so familiar that they had forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "You want to know why we keep going?" she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Because stopping means dying. That is the lesson Earth taught us. Not in classrooms, not in philosophy, in our bones. Every generation of humans that has ever lived learned the same thing. The ice comes and you keep walking. The plague comes and you keep healing. The bomb falls and you keep building. You do not stop. You never stop. Because the moment you stop, you are finished." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "We are not brave, Ambassador. Every person on those ships is terrified. I am terrified. But fear is something we grew up with. It is in our blood. Our ancestors were prey animals on a world filled with things that wanted to eat them. Fear is what kept them alive long enough to become something more. We do not fight because we are unafraid. We fight because we learned a very long time ago that fear is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to move faster." Talon said nothing. He returned to his ship and for the first time in 300 years of diplomatic service, filed a personal recommendation to his government. It was 3 words long. "Commit our fleets." Meanwhile, the hollowed ones were not idle. The swarm had pulled back from the Varenthi corridor, but not to retreat. They were analyzing. For 40,000 years, they had never encountered meaningful resistance. Every civilization they consumed had followed the same pattern: fight briefly, realize the futility, and collapse. The swarm's entire strategy was built on this assumption: break the enemy's will, and the body follows. But these new creatures, these small, fragile, impossibly stubborn creatures, had not broken. The swarm had killed hundreds of thousands of them, and the survivors had simply closed ranks and continued fighting. It was unprecedented. It required a new approach. The swarm split. One half continued to press against the Varenthi corridor, keeping the Allied fleet pinned in place. The other half, a massive force of over 15,000 ships, turned and began moving on a direct course toward the Sol system. Toward Earth. The logic was sound. Destroy the nest and the creatures would lose their will. It was a strategy that had worked against every species the hollowed ones had ever consumed. Cut off the head and the body dies. Human intelligence networks detected the split within hours. The Aegis network calculated the swarm's trajectory and confirmed what everyone feared. The hollowed ones were heading for Earth. Estimated arrival: 18 days. Admiral Asant faced the hardest decision of his life. The Allied fleet could not leave the Varenthi corridor without exposing billions of conquered civilians to the remaining swarm. But Earth, humanity's home, the cradle of their entire civilization, was about to face an assault that would make the corridor battle look like a skirmish. He could not defend both. No commander could. So he did what humans have always done when faced with impossible choices. He refused to accept the premise. "We split the fleet," he announced to his senior officers. "Operation Prometheus. Half our ships return to Sol at maximum speed. The rest hold the corridor with our allies." His officers exchanged glances. Splitting an already damaged fleet was tactically insane. It violated every principle of concentration of force that military science had established over thousands of years. Assange saw their doubt. He did not dismiss it. "I know what the textbooks say. I also know that textbooks are written by people who had the luxury of choosing between two good options. We do not have that luxury. What we have is stubbornness and the fact that the enemy does not understand us yet. They think attacking Earth will break us. They think we are like every other species they have consumed, that our will is tied to a single place, a single world. They are wrong. Our will is not in a place. It is in us. Every single one of us. But we are going to defend Earth anyway. Not because we need to, because it is our home. And humans fight hardest when they are fighting for home." The fleet split. 600 warships, many of them damaged, turned towards Sol and pushed their engines beyond rated limits. They would arrive days before the swarm, barely enough time to prepare. On Earth, the message arrived like a thunderbolt. The heritage world, quiet for centuries, erupted into controlled chaos. The Ironroot shipyards launched every remaining vessel, the reserve fleet that had been held back, the ships still being fitted, even half-built hulls that could fly but had only partial weapons. Every orbital defense platform activated. The ancient stations that ringed Earth, some dating back to humanity's first decades in space, maintained by generations of engineers who treated them like family heirlooms, powered up their weapons for the first time. Mars launched its colonial defense fleet. The mining stations in the asteroid belt armed their industrial equipment. Even the research stations around Jupiter and Saturn, crewed by scientists who had never fired a weapon in their lives, reported ready. And on Earth's surface, something remarkable happened. Civilians did not panic. There were no riots, no mass evacuations, no chaos. Instead, people calmly reported to their designated stations, the emergency roles that every Earth citizen had been assigned since birth but had never expected to fill. Air traffic controllers became sensor operators. Construction workers became damage control teams. Retired veterans dusted off uniforms that still fit and reported to local command posts. Earth had not been attacked since before humanity left the planet. For centuries, it had been a place of peace, a garden world, a museum, a monument to how far the species had come. Now the garden was growing thorns. The message went out to every human, on every world, in every ship across the galaxy. It was not a speech. It was not an order. It was a simple statement of fact, broadcast in clear text so that every species in the conquered could hear it. "They are coming for our home. We will be there to meet them." Back at the Varenthi corridor, the remaining human fleet and their conquered allies dug in. The Kralosi, moved by Talon's recommendation and shamed by humanity's willingness to sacrifice, finally committed their full armada. Fresh Kralosi warships, hundreds of them, sleek and powerful, arrived and took positions alongside the battered human vessels. Other species followed. The Torvan sent their surviving living ships. Smaller species contributed whatever they had: patrol boats, armed transports, even civilian vessels with weapons bolted to their hulls. It was not a pretty fleet. It was not a coordinated fleet, but it was a fleet that had at last decided to fight. Okonkwo watched the Allied ships arriving on her tactical display and allowed herself a small, tired smile. It had taken the near destruction of humanity's fleet to accomplish what 300 years of diplomacy could not. The galaxy was finally standing together. Now they just had to survive long enough for it to matter. The Hollowed Ones entered the Sol system expecting a graveyard. Their calculations were precise. They had mapped the energy signatures of this small yellow star and its collection of unremarkable planets. They had analyzed the species that called it home, short-lived, fragile, technologically inferior. The swarm had consumed civilizations 1,000 times more advanced. This would be routine. The first wave of the swarm crossed the orbit of Neptune and ran into a wall of mines. The explosions lit up the outer system like a second sun. Autonomous mine fields, seeded months ago by deep space engineering crews who had worked in absolute secrecy, detonated in cascading chains that shredded the swarm's forward scouts. Hundreds of hollowed-one ships were destroyed before they even understood what was happening. The mines were crude by galactic standards, just metal casings packed with high explosives and proximity sensors. But there were millions of them, scattered across such a vast area that no fleet could avoid them all. The swarm pushed through. Mines could slow them. Mines could not stop them. But the delay cost precious hours that Earth used to finish its preparations. The second line of defense waited at Jupiter. The gas giant's moons had been quietly converted over the past century. Europa's ice-covered surface hid railgun batteries powered by the moon's tidal energy. Ganymede hosted missile silos buried deep in its rocky crust. Callisto, the outermost of the major moons, had been turned into a sensor platform that fed targeting data to the entire inner system defense network. When the swarm reached Jupiter's orbit, the moons opened fire. Railgun slugs streaked across millions of kilometers with pinpoint accuracy, guided by the Aegis network's calculations. Missiles launched in waves so thick they looked like clouds on the tactical displays. The swarm lost over 1,000 ships in the first hour of the engagement. But the hollowed ones adapted, as they always did. They sent fast attack clusters to silence the moon batteries. Europa's railguns went dark after a brutal close-range engagement that turned the moon's icy surface into a cratered wasteland. Ganymede held out longer, its deep bunkers resisting orbital bombardment, but eventually the swarm overwhelmed it with sheer numbers. The moons bought Earth 2 more days. That was enough. Mars committed everything it had. The Red Planet's colonial fleet, 300 ships, most of them built in Martian shipyards from local ore, launched to intercept the swarm at the asteroid belt. They fought a running battle across millions of kilometers, using the dense asteroid field as cover, darting between rocks the size of cities, firing and retreating and firing again. The Martian crews knew their ships were outmatched. They fought anyway, with the same grim stubbornness that defined their species. The asteroid belt itself became a weapon. Mining charges placed on key asteroids were detonated as the swarm passed, sending mountain-sized rocks tumbling into enemy formations. It was not elegant, it was not precise, but it was effective, and it was the kind of brutal, improvised tactic that only a species with humanity's history would think to use. By the time the swarm reached the inner system, it had lost nearly a third of its ships. For any other enemy, this would have been a catastrophic defeat. For the hollowed ones, it was merely an inconvenience. Over 10,000 ships remained, more than enough to consume a single planet. They reached Earth's orbit and found the last line of defense waiting for them. The orbital stations formed a ring around the planet, dozens of massive platforms, some ancient, some new, all of them armed beyond anything the swarm had encountered. Behind them, the combined Terran home fleet held position, the Iron Root reserves, the returning Prometheus fleet, the converted civilian ships, the half-built warships that had launched from the shipyards with their armor still being welded on. And behind all of them, the Aegis network ran at full capacity for the first time in its existence. The network connected everything, every ship, every orbital platform, every ground-based battery, every satellite, every sensor. It processed the incoming swarm's movements in real time, identifying patterns, predicting attack vectors, calculating optimal responses faster than any living mind could follow. It fed targeting solutions directly to gunners. It adjusted ship formations on the fly. It rerouted supply ships to patch damaged vessels during the battle itself, sending repair crews to critical points before the damage even occurred. The Terran fleet did not fight as individual ships. It fought as a single organism, billions of tons of metal and firepower moving with a coordination that made the Hollowed One's swarm intelligence look primitive by comparison. The battle for Earth was the largest engagement in galactic history. The swarm attacked in waves, each one probing for weaknesses, each one adapting to the defender's tactics. The orbital stations absorbed punishment that would have shattered a continent. Their crews fought in burning corridors and breached compartments, sealing off destroyed sections and rerouting weapons to functioning turrets with the practiced calm of people who had drilled for this their entire careers. Human warships threw themselves into the gaps. When a section of the orbital ring was breached, 3 Terran destroyers moved to fill the hole, pouring fire into the incoming swarm at point-blank range. When one was destroyed, another took its place. When that one fell, another came. The swarm pushed forward and the humans pushed back, and neither side gave ground willingly. On the planet below, ground-based defense batteries added their firepower to the fight. Railgun installations hidden in mountain ranges fired upward through the atmosphere, their slugs punching through the sky and into the swarm ships in orbit. Civilians watched from shelters as streaks of light crossed the sky, each one a slug leaving the planet, or a piece of wreckage falling back toward the surface. The battle lasted 3 days. On the first day, the swarm broke through the orbital ring in 4 places. Human reserve ships counterattacked and sealed 3 of the breaches. The 4th was closed when a Terran carrier, its engines destroyed, used its last functioning thruster to position itself in the gap and detonated its reactor. The explosion destroyed the carrier and everything within 50 kilometers of it, including 200 swarm ships that had been pouring through the breach. On the second day, the swarm concentrated its assault on the night side of the planet, hopping to overwhelm the defense network's ability to coordinate across the globe. The Aegis network responded by shifting every available asset to the threatened sector in minutes, a logistical feat that the Conquered's military analysts would later describe as impossible. Ships that had been defending the day side crossed the planet at maximum speed, arriving just as the swarm's assault reached its peak. The timing was so precise that the swarm's attack formations flew directly into prepared kill zones. On the third day, the swarm began to falter, not because it was running out of ships, it still had thousands, but because every tactic it tried was countered, every adaptation was predicted, every new attack pattern was met with a response that seemed to arrive before the attack itself. The Aegis network was learning the swarm's behavior faster than the swarm could change it. For the first time in 40,000 years, the Hollowed Ones faced an opponent that could think faster than they could. And then the news arrived from the Varenthi corridor. The combined conquered human fleet had launched a massive counteroffensive. The Krelosi, finally fighting with full commitment, had broken through the swarm's defensive perimeter. The Torvan's living ships had adapted to the swarm's biology, developing countermeasures that disrupted its regeneration. Even the Velith, who had surrendered weeks ago, had turned on the Hollowed Ones from within, sabotaging the tribute convoys they had been forced to supply. The swarm was being attacked from both sides. Its forces were divided. Its ability to regenerate and grow was being systematically destroyed. The war did not end that day. It ground on for 11 more months, brutal, exhausting months of system-by-system fighting as the combined fleet hunted down every remaining swarm cluster. There were more battles, more losses, more names read aloud in quiet corridors. The final engagement took place above Titan, Saturn's largest moon. The last Hollowed One-Hive carrier, a monstrous vessel the size of a small continent, made its final stand in Titan's orbit. The battle to destroy it cost 60,000 more human lives. Admiral Assant was on the bridge of the Endurance when the Hive carrier finally broke apart. He had been wounded 3 times during the campaign. He had lost his left arm at the Battle of Mars. He had not left his command chair in 36 hours. He watched the hive carrier die, watched it crack open like an egg, spilling its stolen biomass into the void, and he felt nothing but tiredness. The kind of tiredness that goes deeper than the body, the kind that settles into the soul. He opened a channel. His voice was barely above a whisper, but every ship in the fleet heard him. Tell them, Earth answered the call. Then he closed his eyes. The galaxy rebuilt slowly. The Galactic conquered, reformed, but it was different now, humbler, more honest about its own fragility. The species that had run came back. The species that had fought stood a little taller. And humanity, the young, loud, short-lived species that nobody had taken seriously, was offered a seat on the inner circle. Not out of gratitude, out of respect. The ceremony was held in the rebuilt Concord Assembly Hall. Every species sent representatives. The hall was full in a way it had not been in centuries, and at the central podium stood Captain Rhea Okonkwo, now Ambassador Okonkwo, wearing a simple black uniform and carrying the weight of everyone she had lost. The Krelosi elder who presided over the ceremony asked her a question that the entire galaxy wanted answered. How did you endure? Okonkwo looked out at 200 species. She thought about Asant, recovering in a hospital on Earth, missing an arm and carrying scars he would never talk about. She thought about the 400 ships lost at Varenthi, the 60,000 dead at Titan, the millions of names read aloud in corridors and mess halls and cargo bays across the fleet. She thought about Earth, the beautiful, terrible, stubborn blue planet that had spent 4 billion years trying to kill its children, and had only succeeded in making them unbreakable. You built your civilizations to avoid suffering, she said. We built ours to survive it. Your worlds were kind. Ours was not. It froze us. It burned us. It starved us. It shook the ground beneath our feet and drowned us in our own oceans. And when it was done, we fought each other for land, for food, for ideas, for reasons we have long since forgotten. We have been at war with something for our entire existence. It is the only thing we have ever known. She paused. That is not a weakness. That is what happens when a world spends 4 billion years forging a species in fire. You do not get something elegant. You do not get something refined. You get something stubborn. Something that does not know how to stop, something that looks at the end of everything and says, not today. She straightened. You asked how we endured. The answer is simple. We have always endured. It is the only thing we know how to do. The hall was silent. Then one by one the delegates rose, not all of them, but enough. Enough to fill the hall with the sound of 200 species acknowledging what one small, fragile, impossibly stubborn species had done. Years later, the war would be studied in academies across the galaxy. Tacticians would analyze the battles. Historians would debate the politics. Scientists would study the hollowed one's remains. But the thing that every species remembered, the thing that passed into legend, was simpler than all of that. When the call went out, when the darkness came, when every ancient civilization faltered, it was the youngest species that stood up first. It was the smallest species that fought hardest. It was the species that the galaxy had dismissed, ignored, and forgotten that refused to let the light go out. Because that is what Earth's children do. They endure.